right, welcome everybody to this week's AMA. We're going to be talking about communities, and we're very lucky to have a guest with us this week. So let's just move to some introductions. So as usual, we have Peter and myself, and this week we're very lucky to have Duncan Farquharson with us. Duncan, would you be able to give us a few words of introduction?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Duncan Farquharson. I essentially am the product lead for Community Cloud CMS across the APAC region. So I've been with Salesforce for nearly 8 years now. I actually started over in San Francisco. I joined Salesforce over there, originally focused around the platform. And then in, I think, 2013 or so, when we first began to release Community Cloud as a product, I hopped over and joined the team as a Community Cloud specialist there. And then in 2016, I moved back here to Australia to resume work on this hemisphere.
Excellent. So because we have Duncan with us today, what you're seeing on screen now is the safe harbor statement, which anyone in the Salesforce ecosystem will have seen many times before. So we won't dwell on it for too long, but just be aware we might talk about the future, and you shouldn't make any decisions based on anything we discussed today. So, Peter, shall we crack into it with the first question?
I think we should. So, first question, it's going to be a hard one. What is Community Cloud? So, Duncan, what's your thoughts on that?
That's a hard question to start off with. It's a really interesting question because in many ways, Community Cloud really has been one of those pieces of capability that has significantly evolved over time. When you think back to the original intent around Community Cloud, it was really built off the back of the portal products. So some of you might remember those. And it was really this idea that at the end of the day, what I need to be able to do is I need to be able to extend a couple of those business processes that we have within Salesforce out to external participants. And in the days of a portal, we were really thinking about how do we extend out the sales processes for instance, anyone who is doing channel sales or broker sales or anyone who's selling on your behalf to interact with you as an organization and those core sales processes. And the other side to it was around the service functions. So similar to what we were thinking about the sales processes, we were thinking, hey, it's great. I can, ring you up, I can email, and we might create a case, but I'd want to be able to extend out to my customers that ability to interact with the case, to provide additional feedback, to upload files that might assist in the resolution. So it's really very much originating out of this idea of how do I essentially provide a window around those critical business processes within Salesforce that are relevant to external parties.
Yeah.
So where has it gone? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to reminisce on my first portal implementations, and they were very much designed to do a purpose, and you couldn't really go too far in terms of how you could customize the look and feel, and they kind of felt like a very much an off-the-shelf portal experience, and communities then evolved to take it that next level further, as you were sort of imagining going to dive into.
Yeah, like you would certainly remember, in the early days of communities was really with the sort of setup that you had, you essentially were able to expose a secure interaction with CRM data and business processes. Back in the world of Classic, if we all remember Classic, Classic was, hey, we've got a bunch of tabs and we can create a portal with a bunch of tabs. I think fairly quickly we kind of recognized that was not necessarily everything that the market wanted. And when you think about CRM, it's really great for users who are internal, but it's not the kind of experience you want to wrap around those business processes, not the style of user experience you want to have for external participants. You might remember once upon a time we acquired a product called Site.com.
That's right. Forgot about that.
Site.com really kind of formed the basis of shifting community away from really just a window into CRM into how do I extend out CRM to create specific experiences for external parties, still primarily focused around that idea of I would like to extend out access to data and business processes. So then you'd probably have a bit of experience then in terms of what we added to the product, because a big chunk of what we looked to do was to then say, hey, that's great. There's some business process, there's some access to data, but we want to add collaboration. And I think you've probably got some examples over in New Zealand where you've kind of had a fairly collaborative or a focus around adding collaboration into those experiences.
Yeah, I think that was, there's different use cases obviously for communities as this flexibility has come in and, as you say, emerged beyond the sales use case or the service use case. And so one of the use cases that we've been fortunate enough to have a lot of experience in is the intranet use case of actually using the license type that came out a few years ago of the employee community license, and using that to create an experience for large multinational corporates in building intranet functionality, where we were given the goal on one large implementation of going from a very much an old school site core or older technology intranet that they had, and making it actually interactive and two-way. So it wasn't just management pushing down information, but actually allowed employees to engage and ask questions back up. And I think a lot of the learnings or the inputs that Salesforce brought to that table was how Salesforce internally uses their own products and the CRM, and by extension of it, as I understand, there's groups and chatter and different things, and it's possible you could get into a conversation with senior management, and that's kind of the experience that we were tasked with recreating in a corporate intranet sense, and that provided just a deeper level of engagement between staff and the information that was shared. One of the funny anecdotes from that, because we were leveraging chatter as one of the core pieces of that puzzle, was actually the groups functionality. And people were given the ability to create their own groups, and this was in an organization, 22,000 employees, and these groups were moderated, and if groups didn't last the distance, they would be archived and this kind of thing. But there was the heavy metal fan group, which that was a great example, I thought, of how if you're going to an office building, and maybe in this office building I think there's 4,000 people at headquarters, how do you learn and meet your colleagues that have similar interests, but you would never interact with them in your day-to-day job? So fostering that collaboration is quite key, and then the product allows for that.
Yeah, and I always go back to just pointing out going back to the Salesforce Trailblazer community, formerly known as the Success community. That's a really great example of, that particular community has over 4 million members across the world. There's some amazing people in there who really are astounding in the kind of sharing of knowledge that they do within that community. I always like to talk about Steve Mollis. Mm-hmm. I think I always go and bring up his profile and go, it's always different every time. But last time I looked, he'd answered over 60,000 questions. And so that was one of the other kind of key things that we did around community was, hey, we want to extend it out to external participants to be collaborative. There's a really strong emphasis when we think about that particular use case around how do we do, for instance, things like incorporate in a structured fashion ideation that's coming out of our user base. As you would all know, community is the kind of layer that captures that through the ideas product. And that's fed back into our actual core product management, who have objectives in terms of taking on board that feedback through the idea exchange and incorporating, for instance, a certain number of points that are bubbling up out of that idea exchange in each release. I think, the really big shift has happened in the last couple of years where we've moved away from just thinking about it being how do I expose a sales or a service process to how do I actually leverage everything I kind of know and understand about the customer in my CRM system, but really build out within communities rich, engaging user experiences. There's some really kind of great examples out there in terms of people kind of wanting to say, hey, I have all this knowledge around the people and I have a whole range of business processes at the back end. How do I essentially make that engaging for users to deal with? And so one of the things that we introduced a couple of years back was the Salesforce Community Builder. So this whole idea of how do we help you quickly go to market using GUI drag and drop tools to build out these kind of rich, engaging experiences. They might be wrapped around those kind of business processes. I might be still doing things like providing UIs for people to submit loan applications, or I might be providing a world where I can go in and manage my products, manage my personal details, my preferences, all the way through to doing things like submitting warranty claims around any particular product I might own. All the way through to we see some really great examples these days where really people are looking at Salesforce as a whole, as a platform, as a way to engage their audiences and their customers. And it is that not just community in isolation, it's community as part of the overall Salesforce platform and offering. So community provides a great way to provide a rich, personalized experience to users, but you use it in combination with things like Marketing Cloud so that you have this idea of both synchronous and asynchronous engagement with all of your customers. And so a lot of our focus in terms of where we are thinking about Community Cloud going is really this space that's talked about by analysts like Forrester as digital experience platforms. So how do we really create these rich customer experiences? And you would have noticed recently we acquired a B2B commerce capability. So again, one of those rich experiences we want to be able to support on the platform is actually a commerce-based experience.
So yeah, sorry, I was going to say I think the measure for me is with any public-facing technology like this, the trick is that the end user shouldn't be able to tell necessarily what the underlying technology is. That's the ultimate form of you've made it. That people aren't seeing the same template used over and over and again because they're using a platform that has limited functionality. And I think that's where portals and communities started, but very much now, a number of the communities we've built or have seen others examples out there that you have no idea what technology it's running on, and that's how powerful it is.
So it's that consistent, I should say, user experience all the way through, and really built around that user experience. But we've still got the opportunity to use a template, don't we? If I was a customer and I wanted to get something up and running and I hate using the words MVP, but on that basis, you could still use a template in the first place and then keep iterating along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, templates form the basis of what you do. What we're really looking to do is provide partners and customers the capability to pick up a template and then really use what they want to use out of the template, but then extend it and configure it ideally to suit their particular use case and their particular look and feel. So if you think back a couple of years, we had a template. That was pretty much what you got. And then pretty much it. But it's really kind of changed radically now. So when you think about the whole kind of idea of, hey, I have a template, but now I can, for instance, pick and choose which particular theme. I can create custom themes. I can manage custom themes across multiple communities. So you really begin to get this fairly rich capability to be able to use the template as a foundation, but then apply what you need to do from a look and feel perspective over the top of that. Part of the other sort of capabilities that began to roll out recently are things like where we we take what you would think about a template, like the page structure, which was, originally, hey, there was, I think, 7 or 8 page structures. You could go and create a custom Lightning component to have your own page structure. Where we think about the product going is more along the lines of a WordPress, a Wix.
Mhm.
So for instance, with the flexible page layout tool, you can actually literally start with a blank page and start laying out your stripes, your structures, your mobile responsive grid structure on the fly and build out any kind of page structure you like. So really moving to being this idea of, we want to give you the capability within a template framework to take advantage of everything we provide out of the box, but really let you make that into a visually compelling experience.
It's a pretty powerful thing.
Indeed.
If Duncan, if someone's looking at communities, there's different license types. How do they go about understanding what's the correct license type for their use case?
That's a really great question. I like to kind of think about it fairly simply. At the, well, I was going to say the bottom level, but at one end of the spectrum, you really have this idea that I'm building out an experience. Yeah. At a simple level, we could think about that experience as, how do I, for instance, particularly given the state of the world at the moment, how do I very, very quickly spin up something like a help center to provide the ability to communicate and share knowledge and regular updates around changes to my business at the moment based on everything that might be going on in the world. So we think about that use case as what we call a help center or a public community. And the great thing about public community is essentially there's nobody logging in, so it's a free community up to certain limits around either 500,000 or 1 million page views per month. So in those kind of use cases where you don't need people logging in, you don't really need to think about licensing much. Where you step up from there is really this idea of, hey, maybe I want to have an authenticated environment there. And then it really revolves around understanding a couple of things about the objects that people might want to access. So a great example might be, I want to stand up a community. It's a fairly simple community. I want to expose a couple of business processes that are driven off, for instance, custom objects. Maybe I want to do a warranty registration, or I'd like to do a appointment booking capability, and I might have field service Lightning in the background, something like that. And so where you think about those, they're just really what we kind of talk about these days as using a external apps or commerce portal are the two kind of ways we bucket those into, because they really are sort of companion capabilities alongside everything else. Where you need to think about licensing in a customer community is where you need access to the support objects, primarily case, where you want people to be able to log in, look at the status of their cases, provide additional information around the case, those sorts of things. That's where you step up into a customer community license type. As you might note, there's 2 different license types there, customer community and customer community plus. And I put these into 2 really simple buckets. If you are in a B2C scenario, as in I am working directly with consumers, people that might fall into a person account model, that or very high volumes of users, that falls into a customer community. If you were providing a community, for instance, to provide those support processes to other businesses, you would probably go with customer community plus. And the final license type is really the partner community or Lightning External Apps Plus license type. And that's primarily focused around a couple of simple use cases in terms of broker portals, dealer portals, channel sales portals. And those really are exclusively around that scenario where I want to extend out my sales processes because I have people selling on my behalf.
I think that that distinction between customer community and customer community plus, that's a really good one that I haven't heard it explained that simply before. So makes it nice and easy for.
I've had to explain
people.
it a couple of times. So I've over the many years, I've actually simplified that down into, hey, look, it's really just about who are you trying to engage here.
Very good.
Cool. So one of the questions we've got is someone that's from a not-for-profit background, and they're focused on fundraising and volunteer management. And the question is, how can we leverage a community cloud to drive engagement with our supporters? What kind of examples, or can you talk to that?
Let me think about that. There's a couple of great things that really come into play, I think, around the not-for-profit thing. So, if I take it back and I can go back around just a pure kind of engagement piece, as I think you guys know, I recently acquired a puppy. I thought, if I'm going to spend all my time at home in the next coming weeks, I might as well bite the bullet and get that dog that I've always kind of wanted, because I can spend time with them. He's currently sleeping just behind me, so hopefully he stays asleep for a bit longer. But one of the things in terms of going through that whole process was, there are a whole series of points where you're accessing knowledge, essentially information. How do I do this? What do I need when I bring this puppy home? Those sorts of things. So I actually I read a whole lot of knowledge articles online. So the first kind of point where we think about not-for-profits is really how do they extend out that knowledge around their domain to external users? Those users could also be, of course, volunteers. So the next kind of step we often see really is, well, how do I use the community to engage, for instance, my volunteer network? And really, when I think about volunteers are that extension to your org. So they're the kind of people that, you might want to have interacting with processes. I've done a couple of engagements with customers where it was there was a range of activities that they needed to have volunteers, for instance, sign up to. It's a really great example. Hey, I have a community, my volunteers can log in. While they're logged into the community, I can engage them. I can share content, I can share knowledge, I can talk about the great things, I can inspire them, I can keep them active within my community. But then I can also expose out those kind of key processes that I need those volunteers to participate in. We, for instance, internally in Salesforce, have a community called Volunteer Force. Volunteer Force is literally where I can go and look at any type of volunteering opportunity that's available for me to participate and sign up and commit to attend some of those volunteering activities. Really great example, actually, of using it around volunteer management. I think the other part around that is, obviously, we also do some things there, which is all about, hey, it's not just about the record, it's about, well, how do I engage you? How do I put a piece of content that will inspire you, to keep you engaged, to keep you participating through these activities? And so one of the things I see in terms of a recent development is our new Salesforce CMS. Communities historically were really kind of great at exposing those business processes and that data, but they weren't necessarily very good at giving you the ability to publish engaging content to users within the scope of when they were logged into that community. And so more and more what we see people are doing is really kind of leveraging that CMS capability to create content and share it throughout their community, to inform, to engage, all of those kind of use cases. We've also got a couple of other examples I've seen. Again, principally around that idea that there are a whole range of potentially external participants from different audiences that you want to have collaborating. Over here, we have a number of the CRCs, which are essentially collaborative research organizations. Who have participants in a whole range of different universities and research facilities collaborating around particular research project. It might be at a really high level, I might be trying to solve cancer, something like that. Yeah. And so how do you create a collaborative environment where you have people from a whole range of different organizations able to come in, share knowledge, collaborate all around a single kind of purpose? I think the final thing that we do see increasingly is people looking to kind of leverage and embed within that whole process, obviously, their fundraising capabilities. You can use a community, you can embed some of those fundraising kind of calls in external applications. I think about a lot of these things now in terms of saying, hey, community is a great place to do it. And there are ways you can, for instance, facilitate access to the back end not-for-profit success pack. You can tell I've been around a little while. I sometimes use the old names to essentially allow people to facilitate donation capture through a community. So there's a whole range of capabilities there. I actually find the not-for-profit sector is one of the biggest users that we have within the community space here in APAC.
Have you seen any more really interesting use cases of someone that's doing something that you wouldn't normally think of doing with community cloud, but someone's bending it to make it fit?
Look, I've seen one recently where we're essentially providing a directory listing for an organization where they are a Indigenous business organization, and their whole purpose is to facilitate access to corporate organizations to purchase product from Indigenous organizations, whether it's product or services. I think actually my notepad I have right next to me is actually purchased through an Indigenous organization. And so one of the things they did was they created this idea that, hey, I want to have a directory of all the Indigenous products and services. So I can find a source from an Indigenous supplier. I can go to this directory and search and find the product I'm looking for. Again, managed as a public presentation in an unauthenticated fashion to end users. But from an authenticated fashion, it allows all of those Indigenous suppliers to log in, to manage their listing, their credentials, what services they provide. So really essentially able to manage their own listing within the directory. That was kind of one really kind of nice example. The other one I was going to say, but I haven't quite got to read the email coming through from this morning, was somebody did a really great one for the Guide Dog Association in the UK. Okay. All about facilitating access to information to vision impaired people coming out of the Guide Dog Association.
It's good.
It's very cool.
Very good.
Duncan, so let's say I've stood up a community and I'm encouraging through chatter and groups and that kind of thing, my customers to converse with each other, and really drive some, that's I guess why the product's called communities. Build a community. Is there anything that you've seen, I guess from a non-technical sense that really helps a community manager drive engagement?
Yes. I think we could spend a whole day on this particular subject. So yeah, communities have been a very successful part of our platform. Obviously extending that kind of collaborative capability of chatter out to external audiences. You see it particularly in organizations or software organizations or high-tech organizations where we have very specific areas of knowledge that we want to share. We also see it where people are shifting over to this idea of really kind of digitally focused service. So a lot of organizations have adopted the position where, hey, you know what, you can't ring me up and talk to anybody here about the product. Yep. And so therefore facilitating those kind of peer-to-peer engagement is really kind of important. So the first thing I would say is have a strategy. It's not, if you build it, they will come.
Yep.
It's very much the success of your community, taking off my Salesforce cap for a moment, is really not so much driven by the technology you're using, it's driven by the strategy of engagement through that community. So have a strategy is the first piece. There are key things you want in that strategy, and we find generally the most important thing is executive support to the idea of having a community. Yeah, you tend to have to get people in the organization over that fear of, oh, what if they say something bad about us? My response is generally, well, if they want to say something bad about you, they're going to say it. And in some ways, engaging with you in a community that you own is a far better place than necessarily going and posting it on Twitter, in Reddit, or some other place, which is where they would do it anyway. Because it gives you that opportunity to really kind of own that interaction with those people. And we often think about it as actually it's the opportunity for you to shine as an organization. If you can take a customer who's unhappy with a product or service or something that's been delivered and shift them into a supporter by engaging them with them around their particular complaint, you really kind of, you seal that relationship for life. So strategy, don't be afraid. I think the next thing I would say is think about critically, how are you going to advertise this? People need to be made aware that this capability exists. I think thirdly, one of the things that has always been most successful is having an MVP, a most valuable player program. Yeah, because you really need to incentivize people who are contributing to the community, and you've got to look at people who contributed to a community where they're answering questions on your behalf to other users. You've really got to understand the psychology that sits behind that. Why are they motivated? Are they motivated by fame and fortune? Are they motivated by just being generous and giving back to the community? Are they wishing to establish a profile based on their knowledge, their domain, all those sorts of bits and pieces? And one of the things very early on, if you talk to somebody like Erica Cool, who ran our success community, our Trailblazer community for many years, MVP program was absolutely critical to rolling that out. If I take you back to Steve Mollis, Steve Mollis is a wonderful man, and there's a huge amount of time that he commits to the Salesforce ecosystem in answering that volume of questions. So you need to nurture that engagement. You need to look at, for instance, in this particular case or some other cases, one of the MVPs happened to be a really big fan of craft beer. So part of our MVP program isn't technology based. It's like, hey, once a year, we send that particular person a single bottle of a really special beer. Yep. And so it's all those sorts of things that wrap around, how do I think about optimizing that engagement within the community? And from an MVP perspective, how do you establish role models within the community around what is great behavior? The last thing I would say is you need to have a moderation strategy. Yep, there's a bunch of great tools in the product that help you moderate, but you need to formalize that into a strategy around what rules are you going to have in place? What do you want to block, for instance? What do you want to review? How do you wish to approach people who are new to the community? Those sorts of things. So most of it is really about all those soft things that wrap around your strategy.
So bringing it back to the technology, what features of the product can help identify who those MVP users in the community are, who's participating the most and contributing the most?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the great things is there is a, can't remember the name. There is a package on the App Exchange called, I think it's Reports and Dashboards for Communities with Chatter, something a little bit long-winded like that, but you'll find it fairly quickly. We recommend anyone who's running anything based on a community use those reports and dashboards because they give you a lot of insight into things like search terms to understand, what a customer's looking for within your community. But those dashboards pretty quickly show up to you who is essentially your MVPs, who are the people that you want to kind of reach out and begin to engage with. One of the things that we also kind of think about from a technology perspective, so within community, you can create personalized experiences through audience targeting. I look at a pure play kind of forum community and say, I might create slightly different experiences of engaging with that forum for new users versus existing users versus MVPs. So when I have an MVP come back to my community, I want to create a homepage that is focused on them maybe front and center being able to quickly look through unanswered questions and pick off the ones that they want to engage with. Whereas that's not probably what I would do for a new user. I'd actually probably have a more engaging kind of front end where I'm sharing content, those sorts of things. So the combination of community and content would be more appropriate for new users. I want to share with them examples of success in the community, rules around how you engage, those sorts of things. So it comes down to two things. I think looking at your analytics to understand who is in the MVP or potentially moving up in the field. And then how do you create a experience that's really targeted to those particular users based on where they are in that life cycle?
Some good tips.
Okay. I got stuck. My brain just went into freeze mode. I don't know why. Is there anything inside Salesforce that cannot be exposed out to a community? Is there any type of functionality that's not available, that type of stuff?
That's a great question. So there's a couple of things to think about here. So the first thing is I always kind of walk backwards. So I think about the highest level of capability. And I think about the first thing that filters what you can or cannot expose is really that idea of, well, what does the license give me access to? Yep. So for instance, a customer community license, through a customer community, I wouldn't be able to grant access to an external user to opportunities, leads, campaigns, the sales objects. And that makes a lot of sense because those are the kinds of objects that are really about, or people really need access to when they are in a channel sales or an intermediated sales scenario where you want to extend out those processes and still have visibility in terms of what's going on in your sales channel. So the first thing is what you can expose in a community is driven off what are the licenses that you have. Very simply, if you think about it that way, the partner or Lightning External Apps Plus license types are the ones that give you access to the sales objects. Everything beneath that does not have access to those objects. When you think about the customer community and customer community plus license types, those are the license types that give you access to the service objects. Yep. Remembering that partner communities being the superset above that also give you access to the service objects. So where people need access to cases, that is principally the way that you would do it through a customer community. Noting that you still have obviously capability to do guest user submission of a case for unauthenticated users without having to go through a licensing scenario. But those users wouldn't be able to log back in, check the status, update the case, those sorts of things. So those are the basic pieces. I think the next thing to think about is I personally love the App Exchange. Anytime there is anything that isn't in a community, the first place I go and look is the App Exchange. Because the App Exchange has a whole range of great products in there. And when you think about something from the App Exchange, you have to think there about if it's a free app, if it's an unmanaged package. Yep. You might have constraints around, for instance, the custom objects that are delivered as part of that package that you need to think about. If it's part of a managed package, you really need to kind of check with the provider of that package. In terms of how it is facilitated through potentially exposing that data to a community, and B, if there are any restrictions around that. So that's kind of covering off the App Exchange side. This is where it gets a little complicated, unfortunately. So one of the other things to then think about is to think about what flavor of Salesforce do you have? You might have, for instance, Salesforce. You might have the financial services cloud. So based on what kind of underpinning cloud you have, the types of objects and potentially some of the packaged capability might differ in terms of what you can expose through a community. So for instance, if you have a financial services cloud, there is a specific community license type called Customer Community or Customer Community Plus or Partner Community for Financial Services Cloud, which again is based on that idea that that particular cloud has a set of high value objects. There's a license type that facilitates the right access to those. And those are slightly different because, again, in a broker scenario, there's certain access, certain objects you might want, and some other objects that you need just from a customer perspective. The final thing to really kind of think about here is one of the great things about Salesforce as a platform is the vast majority of what you have in the platform you can easily expose out to the community. And one of the examples I really kind of like to share is this idea of, well, how do I use the community as essentially a way of accessing data that might be stored in a back-end system? So you might have a capability like MuleSoft, for instance, to integrate data from a back-end environment. You might, for instance, want to use some of the capability there to say, what I would like to do is I'm going to use, say, an OData service on that to expose data from a back-end application. And then I can then access that OData or that data or that object using, for instance, external objects in Salesforce. So the ability to point to data in a back-end system without bringing the data across, but essentially establish a virtual model for that data in Salesforce and then pull it through on demand as it's required. The classic example might be, I might want to store, if I'm having an account portal and I want my users to be able to look up past invoices, I might want to store the header information, such as, the date, the status, and the amount in Salesforce. But when they actually go down and look at the line level detail, maybe I've got 100 items in that invoice, I want to pull that through from the back-end system dynamically at real time because I don't need to have all that data in Salesforce all the time. The great thing about that is if I expose that data into Salesforce, say as an external object, I can immediately expose that out into community because anything that you're kind of integrating at a data level into Salesforce is exposable within a community. It's the same way when you think about it going back the other way. If I have a business process that triggers a external call or an external integration going out of Salesforce, putting a front end in community can similarly trigger that kind of process. So really kind of important when you think about what you can and can't expose in community is to think about, firstly, what can I do in the platform? Because community really is an expression of the overall platform.
That's really good. I didn't realize that situation around things like Financial Services Cloud, and that so they have a special community license attached, and I'm guessing some of those special objects that Financial Services Cloud, things like assets and things, those could be exposed in a community, so that if I log in to my financial service provider, I could see that list of assets that I hold with them and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it is very much because when we look at something like Financial Services Cloud, obviously it has its own data model that is really about how do I optimize that for that particular industry. It also has not only the data model, it also has a number of components that are very specific to that data model. So you might take an example of, I think it now the Financial Services Cloud comes with about 20 or 30 out-of-the-box flows. Great tool. Flow is a wonderful thing. Flow is your friend. If anyone wants to think about exposing platform capability through a community. But those are things like, hey, I want to update my details. I want to change my payment details. I want to change people in an insurance policy. I want to add, remove people, add cars, whatever it happens to be. So those kind of flows are really built out very specific as reference examples to work with the Financial Services Cloud data model and the kind of business processes. And so those are some of the other things that you get with one of those industry-aligned licenses.
Somewhat amazing how far things have come in such a short time. It wasn't that long ago that we just had what is now Sales Cloud, and that was pretty much it. So.
Yeah, look, I predate the Marketing Cloud acquisition. So I remember we had Sales, Service, and Platform, and yes.
Very good.
Well, we're probably up against time, so we might wrap it up there. Just finish off with a shout out to our new SFDC Academy product that we're launching at the moment. So the goal here is that you can join a membership program and leverage the combined decades of experience that we have within the Trinio team and help you ensure that you stay on the right path, learn from our experience, and get the best out of your implementation. And we are offering until the end of the month a 50% discount. So there's a code on screen now. We're also moving to an intake model so that we can onboard new members at the same time and create the best experience. So our next intake is going to be on the 4th of May, early next month. So with that, we'll wrap things up. Thank you very much to Duncan. It's been great to have you on board today and answering all of those questions. I'm sure we could have gone on for much longer. We didn't get to all of the questions that users had submitted, so we'll do some follow-up afterwards and get back to people with some answers as well. But Peter, Duncan, thanks for your time today. It's been great to have you on board.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, guys.